Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the final Civic Awareness Series for 2022. I'm Chris Corrigan. I am a programs coordinator here at beautiful scenic Cantini Park, and I'm so happy to have you all with us. Before I get us kicked off and I turn things over to one of our league representatives who will be introducing tonight's speaker, I do just want to quickly go over a few Zoom reminders. I know I got a lot of friends here tonight who don't need those, but bear with me. For my friends at home who are joining us via Zoom, you're going to notice that you have closed captions turned on at the bottom of your screen, and if they're distracting to you and you don't want them, you're more than welcome to turn those on or off as you wish using an option on your Zoom toolbar. And your microphones and your cameras, lost the word there, have been turned off. But don't worry, if you have questions for tonight's wonderful speaker, you can ask those throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll be addressing all questions from our Zoom audience and our in-person audience. Please be thinking of questions. We love to hear from you at the end of tonight's presentation. So keep those coming so we can have a lot of great questions to ask this evening's speaker. One other thing I do want to address is if you're having any sound issues. Every now and then Zoom, its technology, gets a little funky for our at-home audiences. And this is our quick Band-Aid fix. First off, what I'd like you to do is just let us know using the Q&A, and myself and our AV technician here will work as best we can to get that problem fixed. But to keep you enjoying the presentation, what I would love for you to do is just to get a pair of headphones. We find that that is a quick, easy duct tape style Band-Aid for the problem. And also take advantage of those closed captions as well to help you hear our speaker. We want to make sure that you're enjoying and taking everything that we're going to learn here this evening. Now, you've heard a lot from me. One more thing, and then I promise I'll turn this over, is just why are we here? So why is there a Civic Awareness Series? Why is it at Cantini Park? Cantini Park was the country estate of Colonel Robert Rutherford McCormick, who was the president and editor of the Chicago Daily Tribune from 1910 till his death in 1955. In his lifetime, he added to that media empire by founding WGN Radio and later WGN Television. And one of the big things Colonel McCormick would do here at his home at Cantini was host large-scale dinner parties where he encouraged civil discourse amongst his guests who would range from all sides of political issues. It's what he loved most in his life. It's why he loved his newspaper so much, his world's greatest newspaper, if you will. And it's why we partner with the League of Women Voters and why we're very proud to uphold the Colonel's legacy in this way with this partnership. Oh, my phone's listening to everything I'm saying. How fun. Scroll back to the top. I wrote down my league representative's job title. I did not want to screw it up, so I would like to introduce Jean Pierce, who is the chair of issues and advocacy for the State League of Women Voters. So Jean, why don't you come on up and introduce tonight's speaker? Can we get a round of applause for Jean here?
So I'm proud to introduce our speaker tonight. Since 2019, Peter Hancock has served as a reporter on the Capital News Illinois team. When he assumed that position, he brought 20 years of experience as a Statehouse reporter in Kansas. We were talking a bit of a difference when he came here from Kansas. Capital News Illinois uses the expertise of a small team of reporters who provide credible and unbiased coverage of critical news and information about state government to communities throughout the state. It's funded by donations from the Illinois Press Foundation and the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Over the years, the League has depended on the Capital News Illinois for updates that are important to our issues and advocacy work. We truly appreciate that Mr. Hancock is sharing his insights and analyses with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Hancock.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean, and the whole League of Women Voters. They've been very gracious, so gracious, in fact, I thought maybe they'd gotten the wrong person. And a little bit of background, I was born and raised in Independence, Missouri, which is the hometown of former President Harry Truman. And one of my favorite pictures is Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune. Dewey defeats Truman. Whenever someone tells me that the Tribune has broken this big news, I said, well, they're the same people who said Dewey defeats Truman. So anyway, by way of background, how I first became aware of the League of Women Voters, my high school activity was debate. Clearly, I'm not a football player or a basketball player, so I was a smart mouth kid. I was on the debate team, and our debate coach told us about the League of Women Voters, saying that, depending on what the topic was that year, that if you could find information from the League, they're very objective, they're very well respected, and he told us how it came about that when they were debating the 19th Amendment in the early part of this century, one of the arguments against the 19th Amendment was that women don't know anything about politics or government. They're uninformed, they won't be able to make rational decisions. And so they formed the League of Women Voters so that women and men could be informed. It was ratified in 1920, and therefore in the election of 1920, women could vote. It was an outgrowth of the populist movement in the early part of the 20th century, and women did go vote and helped elect Warren G. Harding, who then promptly brought the populist movement to a screeching halt. So I like to say you all still have that to answer for. There's another interesting story about this, a family story. I want to introduce you to these people. My grandparents, Louis and Ellen Furman, on their wedding day in 1924. Louis grew up on a farm just outside of Springfield. Ellen actually grew up in a little town just about 5 miles north of Springfield called Cantrell. And when women got the right to vote, my grandmother told this story, when that election came around, the women of Cantrell, she was only like 19, so she wasn't yet old enough to vote, but she had her mother, her older siblings, cousins, aunts in this little mining town of Cantrell, and they weren't sure what was going to happen. Were they going to get turned away at the polls? Were they going to get harassed? Was there going to be trouble? They didn't know. So all the women meet at one of the women's house, and they said, whatever happens, we're all going to go down there together. So if there's trouble, we'll all be there for each other. And they walk the 1 or 2 blocks Cantrell's a very small town. They go in and vote. And there was no trouble. But my grandmother would say, with the power of their unity and their determination, they made something happen that had never before happened in Cantrell, Illinois. Elected a Catholic man to the local school board. And I think about that, it's like the things people used to care about, like that was a thing. And then that makes me start thinking, 100 years from now, when our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are talking on their vapor phones or whatever, they're going to look back at us and say, that was a thing? I don't know what it is, but I suspect there will be at least 1 or 2 things that they're going to be surprised at. What happened? So anyway, I thought I'd do just kind of a brief overview of what happened in this election. It was, Democrats ran the table. Pritzker won the governor. Democrats keep all of the statewide constitutional offices. They keep super majorities. In Illinois, that's 3/5 or 60%. That's enough to pass a constitutional amendment or override a veto. They've got that. Democrats won 2 seats on the state Supreme Court. So there's now not just a 5-2 Democratic majority, but for the first time in Illinois history, a 5-2 women majority. Republicans did not do so well. They actually ended up losing a couple of seats in the House when a lot of people thought they would at least pick up a few. Given the climate, they did not. And then we just learned that Representative Jim Durkin, who is the House Minority Leader from Western Springs, said he would not seek another term as Minority Leader. Had to kind of take responsibility for it. It was his job to help elect help elect Republicans and didn't get the job done. Very interesting gubernatorial race, I thought. Darren Bailey, the Republican, somehow decided that to be elected governor of the state of Illinois, it would be a good idea to insult the state's largest city over and over again. It was a choice, not one that I would have made, but I think Donald Trump got, 16, 17% in Chicago. Not a lot of Republican votes there, so I figured he probably thought he wasn't really losing anything, maybe picking up sympathy from downstate Republicans or maybe suburban Republicans, but clearly that didn't work. So just a few takeaways. Wanted to talk about gerrymandering works. This was our first election under the new maps. And as you can see, this was a fascinating thing. The state constitution requires that in the year after a census, the legislature has to approve new maps by July 31st. If they don't, then it goes to a bipartisan commission. Problem was they didn't have census numbers because the pandemic delayed the census. Census numbers didn't come out till August. So what they did was pass a set of maps that were not based on census numbers. But they figured it was kind of a placeholder so that they could meet that deadline and therefore wouldn't have to have a bipartisan commission. Republicans were apoplectic about that. Census numbers finally came out in August, so they come back for a special session and finally passed these maps in October. Republicans then sued in federal court. What they were hoping to get was a ruling that says you didn't pass legitimate maps by July 31st. And then they could force a bipartisan commission. Democrats weren't going to go for that, and it turns out a 3-judge panel of federal judges in Chicago also weren't going to go for that, and they sure as heck weren't going to get involved in a state constitutional question. So we got these maps. And I put up a few statistics there. J.B. Pritzker got right about 54% of the vote. Tammy Duckworth got about 56% of the vote statewide. And yet Senate Democrats get 64.5% of the Senate seats. Democrats get 61.8%. Democrats get about 55% of the vote, but they get well over 60% of the seats. That doesn't happen by accident. That has to do with the way lines are drawn. Takeaway number 2, anti-Madigan campaigns don't work. And Republicans have been using this over and over and over again. Every Democrat is part of the Madigan machine. It takes Madigan money. It's part of the Madigan corruption. And every time they do this, Republicans end up being in a super minority. That's Albert Einstein's famous definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, each time expecting a different result. And I remember Jim Durkin had a video news conference on the same day that Madigan was arraigned on the latest charge, corruption charges involving Illinois Bell, or what's now called AT&T Illinois. And he starts going through this whole thing about how corrupt Mike Madigan is. And I said, sir, you do this in every election and you keep losing. Isn't it time to maybe get a different message? Absolutely not. Okay. And I want to talk about the third takeaway. I'm not used to living in a state that has partisan elections for judges. There are 28 states that do it. Again, this was another outgrowth of the populist era. Before we had elected judges, they were appointed in corrupt backroom deals with the governor. And so people thought, bring it out in the sunshine. Let's be open about it. Let the voters decide. And in the early 20th century, it was probably a good idea. But over and over, judicial races have gotten so expensive. The Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law estimates that nationwide there were over $100 million in campaigns spent on judicial races for state Supreme Courts. They haven't gotten the final numbers for this year, but widely suspect that 2022 blew the lid off of 2020. And Illinois is right there at the top of the list. Especially this year when partisan control of the court is at stake. So anyway, there are some people who say it's time for Illinois to re-examine this system. I interviewed a guy from the Brennan Center one time, and they strongly recommend what's called an accountable appointment system, where you have an independent commission, interviews candidates, picks 3, and sends those to the governor, and the governor chooses from one of those. But they also say a lot of states just like elections. Some judges like elections. So if you're going to have elected judges, make them run in nonpartisan races and limit them to one lengthy term, like 10 or 14 years, something like that. It's bad when judges are up for re-election. They tend to hand down the harshest sentences because they're on the ballot and they don't want to be seen as soft on crime. It's just, there are a lot of problems taking your case to a judge who is up for re-election. So anyway, I'm not recommending anything. I don't take a position on it. But I did, Jerry and I both interviewed candidates for the Supreme Court. We interviewed Michael Berg. And I asked him about this. And his feeling was it's time for Illinois to take a long, hard look at this because partisan races for offices that are ostensibly supposed to be nonpartisan to begin with. And also, you're taking campaign money from labor unions, from corporations, from interest groups, people who very likely will have a case before the Supreme Court. They will tell you they never think about where the money's coming from, and they always tell people, I do not make judicial decisions based on campaign contributions, but it just looks really bad. So with that, I tried to keep this as short as possible because I'm really anxious to hear your questions and questions from our online audience, and want to forget them. Final thoughts. So the election is over. Next week, lawmakers come back for the veto session. Have no idea what's going to happen. The issues on the table center around abortion rights. There's a feeling that maybe they could expand the workforce if you allow certain other licensed professionals to perform abortions. The Pretrial Fairness Act. It's great that the veto session is after the election so they can come back and fix some technical problems with that, but didn't ever have to say on the campaign trail that it needs to be fixed. So those are probably the 2 main issues that are coming up, but who knows? I think some people are going to come back feeling very resentful that they just lost their election. And some people are retiring, so it's going to be very interesting. So anyway, with that, I would thank you all for your attention and happy to take any questions. I'll answer the ones that I can.
And so I have a microphone, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll get you the microphone so our online guests can hear your questions. But since I do have the microphone, I guess I have a question or 2 here.
Hey, Barb, we do have an online question if you want to start there.
Oh, okay.
Which is rare. We usually don't start with an online. Why not get a little different on our last one? So we have a guest online, Peter, who says, you point out that Illinois has the most expensive races and political
Judicial races.
Judicial races. Are you referring to I should finish the question. Judicial races only, or in general?
I don't know about races in general. I mean, there is a lot of money spent on political campaigns statewide, in large part because you have one of the most expensive media markets in the country, in Chicago. But yeah, I was talking specifically about the amount of money that gets spent in state Supreme Court races. It's really kind of frightening.
So I guess I'll ask my question for you. Ranked choice voting won overwhelmingly in Evanston. And I wonder if you have heard any rumblings in Springfield of legislation being introduced for it to become a statewide method of voting to help cut down on some of this negative campaigning.
Yeah, very interesting idea. And no, I have not heard any rumblings about that. Generally, the people who gain power by the present system like to keep the present system. I think there might be a lot of people, including political scientists and others, who are going to be watching Evanston to see how that works out and to see what impact it has kind of on the political climate and the culture. So that's going to be very interesting. But at this point, I don't see any movement toward that at a statewide level.
So I appreciate your suggestion that there should be an unbiased committee that's making recommendations for Supreme Court nominees. But as long as they're elected, we've seen how partisan the U.S. Supreme Court is. As a voter, I really would like to know what party the judges are in, as long as I'm electing them. What do you think?
You know, I think it's really kind of sad, as someone who has followed the U.S. Supreme Court for a long time and has always admired it, that now when a decision comes down, a controversial decision, the first thing journalists do and everybody else, who wrote the opinion and which president appointed him? It shouldn't matter, but that's kind of where we are. I can tell you, in Kansas, they use the merit system. There is a nominating commission, and they've tried to get rid of it, that sends nominees to the governor, and the governor picks one. This happened because in the late 1950s, they had a governor. And back then, governors were 2-year terms back then. And I'm forgetting the guy's name. But anyway, a Supreme Court justice died. He had been running for re-election. He lost the Republican primary. And then the Republican candidate lost in the general election. And then the Supreme Court judge dies. Just a few days before Inauguration Day, the governor resigns. His lieutenant governor becomes governor. He's governor for like 3 days. And his only public act was to appoint his predecessor to that Supreme Court case, Supreme Court. It was called the Kansas Triple Play. The next year, Kansas voters changed the Constitution, so that could never happen again. And I think it has worked out well, and I think you end up with a judiciary that is much more independent. If there's anything I can notice about the judiciary here is they're a lot more reticent to go up against the legislature or the governor. They pay a great deal of deference. I would mention school finance in particular. That's been taken to them because Illinois has one of the most inequitable school funding systems in the country, and Supreme Court will not touch it. That's a political issue. They just won't. Regardless of the fact that the state constitution says the legislature has the primary duty of funding public education, they don't. The state state money accounts for about 1/3 of school funding, and it's local property taxes that are the other 2/3. And it results in a horribly inequitable tax system, inequitable education, and the Supreme Court won't touch it. Anyway, I think having greater separation between legislative, executive, and judicial branches, I just think it's great. Yes, sir.
A comment and then a question. So,
1 second.
I'm pretty loud.
They can't hear you.
Okay, so just a comment and then a question. So I've been around Illinois long enough where the Democrats were out in the desert for years.
Oh, yeah.
There was Jim Edgar, George Ryan, Jim Thompson. So the factor that, from my perspective, that changed things was one Mr. Michael Madigan. I came out of the labor movement. I'm part of the Madigan machine. He taught us a lot how to run elections. Mm-hmm. Candidate recruitment, voter registration, getting your pluses out to the polls on election, all the fundamentals, which quite frankly, many times on the Republican side, I don't see that. So you can beat up Mike Madigan all you want, but I learned a lot from him. And you probably know this. He cleaned up Springfield. Prior to Speaker Madigan, you would have seen how bills, everything was corrupted. So my question, thank you. My question is I understand the importance of polling when it comes to identifying issues, message development, but is it time we just put polling to bed when it comes to get out who's going to actually vote?
Good point. And back first to your earlier point, it's very fair to point out that Democrats do not have a monopoly on corruption in Illinois. Everybody's got dirty hands here. I don't know where that comes from, but there you have it. With regard to polling, and this is what really frustrates me at election time, is how pollsters and pundits have always trying to come up with some new way to slice and dice the American population into these discrete demographics so that one statistician will come out and say, now I know which demographic is going to decide the election. I don't know. Women age 30 to 35 without college educations who have incomes above $60,000 a year. Because the message they're sending is that demographic is going to decide the election, you're not. Like your vote doesn't count. And I just reject that premise. So, we use polling carefully. You look at the quality of the poll. You try to figure out if there's any real message there. But other than that, at least at Capitol News Illinois, we don't spend a lot of time. We tell people who the candidates are, where they stand on issues. Occasionally, polling information helps tell a story. There's a website you're probably familiar with called 538.com, run by Nate Silver, who used to be at the New York Times. And he has sort of sabermetrics. He has this way of combining polling and giving them different weights depending on how recently it was done, the quality of the polling firm. And it was like meta polling, and he puts it together. And toward the end of the election, he was saying there was about a 13.5-point spread between Pritzker and Bailey. That's right about where it was. So to your point, I think journalists really need to be careful about, just because there's a poll out there doesn't mean it's news.
Chris, do we have any questions online?
Oh yeah, the online questions are flowing in tonight. I'm very excited by this. My job has gotten a lot more interesting at the Civic Awareness Series. Peter, are you surprised by how quickly DuPage and other counties have turned blue? It seems not that long ago that DuPage County was pretty Republican. Thoughts on how this happened?
I am not terribly surprised. We have seen this in major metropolitan areas across the country. I know it has happened in Kansas City, the Kansas City suburbs over on the Kansas side. I've heard it happens in the Philadelphia suburbs. I think there are a couple of things happening, and I've witnessed this. There's a generational change. The kids who are just now turning 21, 25, the Generation Z, They are not like their parents. They're very politically engaged. They are probably the most racially and ethnically and religiously diverse generation this country has ever seen. It used to be the suburbs were what we called the country club Republicans, or what a former colleague of mine back in Kansas called the Birkenstock Republicans. In the Kansas City suburbs of Johnson County, that was the most Republican place on earth. And they went for a Democrat for governor last time around. And I think Hillary Clinton carried that area. The other thing going on, and this is what makes it confusing, is especially here in Illinois, it's hard to tell whether that's a permanent change or was that just revulsion against former Governor Rauner and then Donald Trump. Those are two really polarizing politicians who brought people out of the woodwork to vote against them. Are we going to see the same thing, now? I don't know. But it is true that the once solidly Republican suburbs are not that solid anymore.
Next question.
Another question before I do this next online question, real fast for my in-person audience. When Barb comes around with the microphone for you guys, just to help our friends at home, make sure the microphone, this looks silly, but the microphone is really close to your mouth because that way they can hear you. They're having a little trouble hearing all of your beautiful voices. I know mine is lovely, but they want to hear yours too. So another online question. If an independent committee vets the potential candidates for the Supreme Court, excuse me, who decides who gets to be on the committee?
It can go a lot of different ways. Usually these kinds of things, the Republican and Democratic leaders in the House and the Senate will get a certain number of appointments. The governor will get a certain number of appointments. There are a lot of different ways you can structure that. One of the biggest controversies, and I don't know why it's a controversy, has to do, usually they're made up of a combination of lawyers and non-lawyers. And there's a feeling that if lawyers get a majority, then basically it's the Bar Association picking its own judges. I really have not seen that many cases, though, where a nomination was split down the middle with lawyers voting in one way and the non-lawyers voting another way. It just doesn't really happen. But, you can look around the country. Different states have different ways of setting that up. And I'm not recommending, it's not an editorial position. I just think, it's something the people of Illinois should think about.
And then let's do one more, and then I'll pass it back over to Barb. What effect has the ongoing population migration out of Illinois had on the state's evolution into one-party governance by Democrats?
Well, first of all, this migration out of Illinois, the 2020 census showed that it wasn't that big. Well, okay, I want to clarify that. After the census is over, the Census Bureau does what's called a quality check. They're not revising their numbers. They're just looking at weak spots. Were we undercounting in this type of neighborhood, or were we overcounting in that type of? It's just a quality check, and based on that, they say it is statistically likely that Illinois was undercounted. By how much, I don't know. But if you look at the midpoint of the range, I forget what the number is, but it's very possible that Illinois' population actually did grow to top over 13 million. So a lot gets made of that. A lot of times those estimates are based on information supplied by like U-Haul and Ryder trucks. Who's moving where? Are they coming in? But actually, they gather a lot of data. And they're also, that you can track change of address forms and things like that. But those estimates that you see, also the Census Bureau does annual population estimates based on information that they have available to them. And they were estimating that Illinois was losing a lot of population. But when the census came around, it really didn't. So I go with the census numbers. That's the most real, they're the best numbers we have, and it does not show the population evaporating. I moved into Illinois. I'm the one, apparently. Sir. Yeah.
Okay. So the Republicans, and I was just with one, who feels that it was Madigan's money that is still present, and it affected everything. And I've heard that before. I want to mention that you mentioned ranked choice voting. Probably a lot of people don't know what that is, and I think it'd be well to explain what it is. Okay?
Yeah, so right now you get a binary choice. You vote for this candidate or you don't vote for that candidate. In ranked choice voting, you can actually vote for two candidates. I like this person. In the event this person doesn't win, my second choice would be this other person, and on down the line. It makes ballot counting extremely complicated. It means that people like me don't get to report the results of the election on election night. It's a very complicated process. So often, and again, there are a lot of ways you can set this up, but usually they set a rule that says the winner has to get 50% of the vote. If nobody gets 50% of the vote, then you drop off the people at the bottom, the people who got the least amount, and then you go look at people's second choice, and you add those up. And at some point, somebody will come out with more than 50%, whether it's first, second, or third choice. And so, yeah, there's a theory that it has an impact on the political climate. You don't necessarily go negative as much because that person you're going negative against might be somebody's second or third choice. It's going to take a while to do some studies to see what kind of an impact it really has. But at the same time, especially in a state where you have one-party government, it's very difficult for Republicans to break through at any level. But maybe if there was ranked choice voting, that Republican candidate might be somebody's number two pick. I don't know. I'm going to be very interested in watching what happens in Evanston. It's a fascinating thing.
So there's been a lot of implications that Pritzker might try a presidential run at some point. And I'm just curious about your perspective or the perspective in Springfield about his potential candidacy.
Okay, so he went to New Hampshire to give a speech. Nobody goes to New Hampshire just to give a speech. And right about the same time, I think you saw Gavin Newsom of California was kind of on a similar tour. And so that's often interpreted as an indication that somebody is testing the waters. But of course, you're not going to announce, because if you announce, at this point, all kinds of campaign finance laws kick in. And so they just kind of tease people. Is he going to run? I don't know. I know that during the campaign, he said his intention was to serve 4 years of another term. He supports President Biden. He wants President Biden to make another run, to run for re-election, and that's all he'll say about it. Worth noting that if President Biden were re-elected, he would be inaugurated in January 2025 at the age of 82. I think there are a lot of Democrats who said, or people who supported him, feel that there was kind of an implicit bargain here. We put you in office for 4 years, get Donald Trump out of office, spend 4 years just not messing anything up, and then let the younger generation come in and follow you after that. But then again, you know, if Joe Biden were to announce right now he's not running for re-election, the next 2 years would just be chaos with other Democrats jockeying for position. And I think he still has things on his agenda that he wants to accomplish, and none of it would happen in that kind of an environment. Is J.B. Pritzker going to run for president? I don't know. Every time we've asked him, you know, he doesn't give any indication like that. So I think he's very popular in Illinois. How much that popularity carries over to places like Oklahoma and Montana, I don't know. So.
I do have a question for you.
Okay.
I'm going to hog the microphone and ask it. As covering the state news and Springfield news, what issues would you have liked to seen discussed during this last election cycle that weren't discussed? You know, things that we probably should be aware of, know about, and have an idea of what's going on. Education, obviously, is one that you mentioned earlier.
I think education should be much more at the center of conversation everywhere, Illinois, nationwide. It's the one thing we can do for our children that, you know, really helps determine the course of the rest of their lives. And it should be high quality education. It should be equitably funded, and that is all I'm going to say about that. But yeah, education is one that I wish got more attention. Another, I think, that needs a lot of attention is the crushing amount of debt that the state of Illinois is carrying, and the state of its unfunded pension funds. I will give the governor credit. He balanced the budget, and as a result, he got some credit upgrades. He likes to say that there have been 6 upgrades. 3 rating companies have given the state 2 upgrades each. But it's still one of the lowest, if not the lowest, credit rating of all 50 states. But it's moving in the right direction for once. The state was at 1 notch above junk status. You go below that, you cannot sell your bonds to institutional investors like insurance companies, mutual funds, retirement plans. You can only sell them to what are called vulture capitalists who charge very high interest rates. And I think that is something that still needs more attention, more discussion. It's very difficult to educate the general public about it, but there are ways. And it's something that everybody in Illinois needs to take responsibility for, you need to own up to it, and figure out a way to get out from that crushing debt. Yes, sir. Oh.
Right here.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about voter turnout in Illinois, and did it vary across the state and by age group, and if it was higher, what are some of the reasons why you think it was higher?
Well, here's one of the problems is there is no central place to go to find out what the turnout was until the State Board of Elections certifies the results on December 5th. Up until then, there are 105 voting jurisdictions, one for every county, and then a handful of cities have their own municipal election boards. And you have to go to each one of them and tally it up. We don't have the resources to do it. The AP used to do it. I think they're kind of they may be getting away from that now. So individually, newspapers, TV stations will get the numbers for their local areas, and out of that we can kind of get a general idea. The answer to your question is I don't yet know what the turnout was. Off-year midterm elections, turnout tends to be a lot lower than in a presidential year. It just happens. I didn't spend much time talking about the constitutional amendment that was on the ballot, the Workers' Rights Amendment. Many people see that as just a blatant attempt to gin up the labor vote and get them out in an election that they wouldn't ordinarily, might not ordinarily vote in. So it wasn't terribly surprising. It appears to have passed, but the rules are really complicated on constitutional amendments and don't yet know. So long-winded answer to your question is I don't know what the voter turnout was. And I don't know really what the national trends were. I know mail-in voting, advance voting, has gotten to be very, very popular with people. Of course, we relied on it heavily in 2020 during the pandemic. And people just really seem to like that. And it appears that nationwide, at least, early voting, either early in person or by mail, really kind of, it was way up. So,
Chris, online questions.
Of course. There is an organization called Injustice Watch that helps people find out about judges when we vote on judicial retention, but this seems to be only for Cook County. Is there any such thing for the rest of us?
I would like to think the League of Women Voters is one resource you can go to. They interview candidates and your local newspaper. If there's a judge who has behaved inappropriately on the bench or has issued very questionable rulings, it should make the local news, and you'll hear about it. So yeah, I would say check with your League of Women Voters, check with your reliable local media, and then try to do your own research. Look up their backgrounds, look up to see if, they've been involved in controversial cases. That's really about the best you can do.
Alrighty. With such overwhelming Democratic control, do you anticipate any additional ethics reform?
No. I think they got as much as they could the last time around. And that wasn't much, but it did put some limits on the revolving door. People, who serve in the legislature leave and immediately become lobbyists lobbying the legislature. They put some controls on that. I think there's a lot more that they could do. I'm trying to think of how to put this delicately. It's hard to legislate ethics. You have to change the political culture of Illinois. Excuse me. And in some pockets of the state, including Chicago, politics is seen as a career for people. It's not public service. They found something that they're good at. They found something they can advance in, and they've chosen this as their career. A lot of times, I think Mike Madigan might be an example of this, did not really hold any deep philosophical beliefs of his own. His job was to help other Democrats be successful in their jobs by helping them advance their agendas, which in many ways is what an effective leader often does. But it's this where's mine culture. The state is spending money. Where's mine? I want my cut of it. It just, there needs to be more of a culture where people look at government service as public service, as something, there's some sacrifice involved in it. And until that starts developing, and you have to start with young children and raise them to believe that, that's how you clean up corruption.
So I'm just going to build off of what you said, and then as you all have to just take care of the microphone next time, so you get to ask your questions. No, you said there's a culture of my culture. How has that culture affected journalism? And you said to look to a reliable paper. Do you find a change in journalism that it's become perhaps more biased or more focused on the sale of papers versus reporting?
How has it affected journalists? It's a good question, because there is also kind of a culture within the press corps. There are shared values, shared priorities. Unfortunately, I can't speak for everybody, but I think there's a certain level of cynicism in pockets of the press corps that has just come to expect to see these kinds of scandals come up, and we're not surprised by them. And I'll give you an example. We were talking about this earlier before the meeting. It was my first year up here, 2019. We got wind that a search warrant was being executed in a state senator's office, State Senator Martin Sandoval. And so everybody goes rushing up there. You're waiting for the FBI or somebody to come out, wanting to get a picture, maybe you get a quote from somebody, And so we're standing around there, and everybody knows that I had just moved here from Kansas. And one of them looks at me and says, "Yeah, bet you don't see this back in Kansas every day." I said, "No, you don't." Yeah. This does not happen in Kansas. But to them, it's like become part of the norm. And it shouldn't be. But at the same time, after you've I've been here for 4 years, and I'm losing count of how many current or former lawmakers I've seen get indicted in federal court. You do get kind of numb to it after a while. So that's how I think it has affected the news media. We've just kind of gotten numb to it.
Oh, when Lisa Madigan, when she chose not to run again for Attorney General, there was speculation she was going to seek U.S. Senate, and I haven't heard anything from her. Does she just keep a low profile? Is she going to remount the campaign?
I think part of and I was not here when Lisa Madigan was Attorney General. I don't know. I did know the Attorney General of Kansas and his family, and there's the National Association of Attorneys General, sometimes referred to as the National Association of Aspiring Governors. Anyway, the word that I had heard, and I can't vouch for this, was that as long as her father was Speaker, there was no place for her to go. There was just kind of that ceiling. And so to my knowledge, I think she went back into private practice. I don't know if she has political ambitions now or not. Certainly with her father in the news so much, and not in a good way. I think she would have a lot of baggage to carry. But I have no personal verifiable knowledge about what her plans are.
You have an online guest who's offering you the opportunity to make an extremely shameless plug, and I'm going to let you have it. Can you talk about your organization's launch into broadcast news operations in 2023?
Okay, so yes. This year, we are largely funded by the Robert McCormick Foundation. We received a very generous increase in our funding. And one of the things was they want there's a lot of interest in seeing us. Right now, we're run out of the Illinois Press Foundation. Our news goes out to members of the Illinois Press Association and to others. Excuse me. They would like to see us team up with broadcasters, the Broadcasting Association, to try and reach more. So it's a very exciting thing. I think we are currently hiring for an audio, radio style reporter right now. I have to say I'm not in those meetings. This is like many, many miles over my head. But I do know we're hiring for an audio reporter. I don't know what the plans are for maybe television. But the business model is the same, which is that we put it out there. Stations are free to take it or not take it. The overall philosophy, I mean, we were formed because so many news organizations were vacating the State House. It's very expensive to cover a State House, especially if you're not located in the capital city. And we all know newspapers' financial condition right now is not that great. So there was this vacuum, and so we came in to fill the vacuum so that people who live outside of Chicago and Springfield and St. Louis can still get news out of the State House. And it has been successful beyond anything any of us thought would happen. But now, you know, Harrisburg, Illinois is getting State House coverage. You know, Murfreesboro is getting State House coverage. And we hear from the editors who are just eating it up. So we would like very much to extend that same sort of model into radio and television.
And this guest has also pulled us back into the evening's discussion topic. Do you see any Democrats in either the House or Senate successfully work across the aisle? Do you think the potential for bipartisan legislation will decrease because of the strong Democratic showing in this last election?
I have seen incredible bipartisanship on certain issues. Medicaid and healthcare policy is one of them. There is this, what's called the Medicaid Working Group. It's not a committee, because the Constitution says committee meetings have to be open to the public. But it's a group of lawmakers. Tom Demmer, who stepped down to run for state treasurer, was the Republican on those. And I remember him telling me they meet informally, they take in ideas from wherever, and because it's sort of off the record, everybody can just kind of relax. And they have come up with some really good healthcare policy on a bipartisan basis. And it tends, you know, when it comes up to the floor, it's unanimous or near unanimous because it's been through this process. That process has been getting strained lately. There was a lot of bad feeling at the end of this last legislative session because they had a Medicaid bill that they thought everybody agreed to, and the Democrats started tacking stuff on before it went to the floor of the House, and a lot of Republicans resented that. But that working group process, it has been successful in bringing about not just bipartisanship, but some really good and imaginative, creative public policy for Illinois.
All right, I think we got time for one final question. And that one will be, with the SAFETY Act happening in January 2023, what are your concerns with the bill, and what do you think is good with this bill?
I usually don't weigh in with opinions about bills. They let me cover the legislature, they don't let me vote in it. Having said that, I think there is general recognition that there are parts of the SAFETY Act that need to be clarified. And there's some concern that maybe it doesn't give judges enough discretion. There are portions of it that are inconsistent. You know, what are the standards for detaining a person at their arrests versus the standard of detaining a person after their arraignment. And there's some very highly technical things that need to be cleaned up. I think obviously there is a lot of angst about going to a system where we don't have cash bail. And we're just going to have to see how it works out. But, you've all heard the Democratic argument that, Republicans say all these people are going to get released as soon as they're arrested. Democrats say they're getting released now if they've got money. It's just the people who don't have money are getting stuck in jail, often sometimes for months at a time, having been convicted of nothing. They just don't have the scratch to pay the bail bond. So, that's the argument. We'll see how it works. I don't know.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. I'm going to turn things over to Judy Beaver for our closing comments. Judy, if you'd like to take the podium. And a big round of applause for Peter as well.
Thank you so much.
So thank you, Peter Hancock, for helping us sort out the midterm election results for DuPage County in Illinois. We appreciate your spending your evening with us. And also thank you to our audiences in person and virtual for participating tonight. And a big thank you to our partners at Cantini. We always appreciate you. And also thank you to our sister leagues, Central King County, Glen Ellen, Naperville, and Roselle Bloomingdale. And so we'll resume our Civic Awareness series in February, so please join us then. We look forward to another year of programming. We'd love for you to send your program ideas to Chris Corrigan here at Cantini or through our Wheaton League of Women Voters website. And be sure to check out for future programming events from now until February on our website. So enjoy your holidays and good night, everyone. Thanks so much.